The galaxy burns. Machines of war rampage across the stars in a never-ending cycle of conflict. But there was one problem no one could ever have predicted.
The infrastructure on this planet is absolutely woeful with all these tanks and whatever else rolling all over it.
Only one band of heroes can stand against this looming threat. Unfortunately, they're normally standing on a picket line. Whenever you're hobbying, but particularly when you start a new project, there's always going to be things that you pick up that make your life easier through the process. In this video, I'm going to walk you through 10 lessons I learned painting the first 10 models for the UGLY Grot Roadworker army. By seeing the mistakes I make, hopefully you can avoid the same ones in the future. Now, the whole crew was firmly secured to their bases to paint the skin. I covered how I did that in my last video last week, so check that out if you haven't already. I had to start then by prying the models carefully off of their bases. This all went really smoothly, too smoothly, right up until I got to the last guy. This was the model I painted last week, and I think I put a little bit too much super glue on his feet. Fortunately, with a bit of green stuff sculpting and a spot of black paint, he was good as new. This is lesson number 1. If you're planning on detaching your models from their bases at any point, maybe for another stage in the painting process, make sure they are not attached too securely. Now that the bases were ready, it was time to turn them into a cross-continental superhighway, which also looks surprisingly like the perpetual London roadworks. For this, I used an old Eons of Battle video as inspiration. The main road surface will be made up of corkboard. The rough texture perfectly suits for roads and also takes dry brushing really well. I'll link that video in the comments down below. To start with, I put a load of Gorilla Gel glue onto the bases. As the corkboard is fairly absorbent, I wanted to make sure I got a good stick. Once stuck down and left to dry, I tore around the edges of the bases, leaving interesting organic rips and tears in the corkboard. I also posed some of my grots on the bases, to identify areas where extra greebles or details might help to emphasize the effect. These varied from army painter scale fence and small bits of metal wire, to resin sprue and more bits of cork, all of which were stuck down with more superglue. I also gouged out some potholes and cracks in the road surface. The bases were then primed with Vallejo black primer before being painted black. I was sure to get into all the crevices at this point, as you don't want the bare cork showing later, but I avoided the metal areas to keep them shiny. I then dry brushed the road, first using a grey, which I liberally applied over the whole of the base, and then a more specific white highlight, which was focused around the edges of the bases, as well as the exteriors of any potholes or gouges in the road surface. Lesson number 2, less is more here. Particularly with the white dry brush, make sure you get almost all of the paint off of the brush before you take it to your base. You want it so that it takes several passes with the dry brush before you get to see that white colour building up. This gives you a lot more control over the effect. I next applied some road markings, white dashes, lines, and every Londoner's worst nightmare, double yellow lines using white and yellow paint. Next, I applied some rust, weathering, and general wear and tear to the metal areas. I used Agrex Earthshade, Rhinox Hide, and Nuln Oil. To finish the bases off, I wanted to show the dirt underneath all of their road working. I mixed up my own version of Games Workshop's Stirland Mud to go into the deeper holes and cracks. I mixed sand and Rhinox Hide with an old crappy brush, which I then applied to the bases. Lesson 3 here, I think I had a better effect when I mixed some black into this mix, as Rhinox Hide was probably a little bit too light. However, what I did really like was that the combination of these two colours, the very, very brown Rhinox Hide mix and also with more black, gave it a more organic appearance as there were more different colours of earth. You can also vary the amount of sand you're including in here to have a coarser or a smoother texture. With that, the bases are all done. So it's time to move on to the small matter of painting the grots to go on top of them. This leads us neatly on to lesson number 4. I really fell in love with these goofy, hilarious models. So much so that I forgot that they're going to be used as a unit of Gretchin in our games of Warhammer 40k, the kind of unit that dies to a light breeze, let alone a hail of gunfire. Lesson number 4 then is if you want to paint a whole squad, it's best not to go psycho mode on the very first member of that squad. I decided to start with one of the more complex models, this guy with a strange blunderbuss contraption, and I went all out. Wood grain on the gun, a check pattern on his helmet, and even hazard stripes on the gun cable. Oh, and I added a traffic cone to the end of his gun. Of course. While I'm really pleased with how he turned out, I wish I'd put in maybe 80% as much effort into this first guy, so I could have had more time to commit to the other 9 grots in the squad. Speaking of which, lesson number 5. Open pose models are much easier to paint. If you can leave your models in open poses, it makes it so much easier to get to all the details. Check out this hammer-wielding grot. Apart from the areas near the face where the arms get in the way, all the rest of the details are super easy to reach. This makes base coating a breeze and highlighting a much simpler task. Be better than me, don't glue all your models together before attempting to paint them, you'll thank yourself in the long run. Next, it's on to one of my favourites from the squad, the guy who didn't get the memo about carrying traffic cones and decided to be a traffic cone. This was a lot harder than I expected. Painting him was easy enough, as I knew most of the details would be covered by his traffic cone outfit, but making the cone was tricky. I used the same cone creation technique as found in my previous video, but I then used scissors to cut out holes for his arms and face to go. The difficulty came from the fact that it was super awkward to insert him in, add super glue, and then to add the white stripe around my traffic cone. That's lesson number 6. When you're painting, but particularly with converted or unique models, you need to make sure you have a plan of how you're going to be attacking the paint job and also the construction of your conversion. Trying to get into the details with my white paint for the strip around the traffic cone was really hard because I'd already put it on the model and also because I'd already painted a lot of the areas around. With all that said, the application of a bit of Ardcoat gloss varnish to the cone really made it come alive, and I can't help but smile every time I look at his stupid grot face poking out of the traffic cone. On to the next guy, a grot with a huge spanner chilling on a road barrier. Now lesson number 7 here is specific to conversions. Be careful of the structure of your model. For this guy, I wanted to trim away some of the resin on the underside of his foot to get him to look like he was sitting rather than standing on debris. However, on this particular sculpt, that piece of resin was connected to several other parts of the model, and this seriously affected the structure of the whole model. This led to some shearing happening where his leg was starting to come away from the rest of the body. Fortunately, I spotted this pretty early and was able to rectify this by sticking him to the block with super glue, but you have to be really careful as otherwise you can end up with bits pinging off in all sorts of directions. And this is particularly annoying if you've only got one copy of that model to work with. For lesson number 8, it's all about the cleanup stage. The cleanup stage is probably the most important stage of painting a model. Due to the way that miniature painting videos work here on YouTube, you probably won't hear people or see people doing very much of the actual cleanups on their models. It isn't glamorous, but sorting out edges, worn down paint, or small mistakes makes a massive difference to the final outcome of your model. This is particularly apparent where 2 very different colours meet, so pay particular attention to those. Lesson number 9 is all due to the paint scheme that I'd selected for these guys. You may have noticed I've been painting a very vibrant yellow colour as the main armour colour. Painting yellow. People hate painting yellow, myself included. But through this process I've realised yellow needn't be difficult. The thing I realised was that I've been painting yellow wrong all of this time. When I paint my blood angels in their red armour colour, I start from a dark base coat like rhino's hide, and then on top of this use my Mephiston red as the mid-tone. For a colour like yellow, working from the dark colour and moving up doesn't work, and it's going to lead to a really patchy result. The trick here? Paint yellow. It sounds really obvious, but the problem is that yellow has really terrible opacity when compared with colours like grey, brown, or pretty much any other colour. The trick then is to first base coat your model with white, and then over the top of this apply your bright yellow paint. You're effectively working from the brightest colour down to the darkest, rather than the other way around. I was amazed at how much clearer the yellow sections became on my grots working from light to dark colours. Shades are also your friend in this regard, with Cassandora yellow being my shade of choice for a really poppy yellow. Now lesson number 10 is entirely on me. Give yourself enough time. As I record on a rolling weekly schedule, I only had a week to get these guys done, which would have been fine, except for the fact that I started on Thursday night. Everyone's time for hobbying varies, but try to avoid leaving yourself in a rush. For me, this is particularly sad as I think I can do a lot more with this last guy riding the pneumatic drill, but a lesson learned is a valuable one. All in all, they turned out really well. I really love this scheme and I can't wait to do more conversions and interesting paint jobs for them in the future. In the meantime, my name has been Ollie, this has been my hobby, and I'll see you next time.